wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that this workshop is taking place on. I'm on Boonwurrung land here. I wanted to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So my name's Ciara Lynch. My practice is mainly textile art. I'm really interested in slow processes, knitting, weaving, embroidering, dyeing. I really enjoy stories. I love listening to other people's stories and I love telling stories. A couple safety things to remember. Make sure there's an adult around if you feel uncertain. Always be careful with your fabric. You don't want it to sit on the bottom because it's going to burn. You want to continuously stir it. Don't ever leave it unattended. Always stir with a metal spoon. A wooden spoon is going to get stained. Use gloves, otherwise your hands can be covered in dye. You can burn yourself. Be careful dyeing in your kitchen. A lot of this stuff will stain the bench, so lay down old tea towels, old towels, just to ensure that your workspace is not destroyed. Here's some materials that you might need. A plastic bucket, either citric acid or salt, your muslin. You can use anything that you have at home that has an open weave, like stockings and pantyhose and that kind of thing. Just an elastic band. Then we've got our fabrics here. You can use old bed sheets, old clothes. Here I've got silk, linen and cotton. They're all organic fibres. You can use anything that's a blend or an organic fibre. You can also try synthetic fabrics. I just found they don't really give as much of a result. If you're making a garment, I would leave the whole fabric as it is. Don't pre-cut it. They can shrink a little bit. It's going to change how your pattern pieces look. Also, it really enhances a frayed edge, which is really hard to sew with. Here's some things that you can dye with. Anything that leaves a stain or a pigment is worth a try. Blueberries and saffron is what we'll be using today. We've also got turmeric, paprika, onion skins. These are the results of the onion skin. You can also use black beans or even just like the juice of black beans, tea and coffee as well. You'll also need a big pot and a source of heat, so a stove or an outdoor burner like we're using. Just be careful if you're using synthetic fabrics or synthetic dyes. I would probably avoid using a pot you're going to cook in. Stuff that you can eat is fine. So far I've soaked my fabric here in a pre-mordant. Pre-mordanting is a process in which you soak the fabric in something like citric acid or salt. You want to soak your fabric in a tablespoon of your pre-mordant and cold water. I've just used this citric acid and I've soaked that for around 20 minutes minimum. I put a little bit of citric acid in both pots as well. So a tablespoon in your pre-mordant and a tablespoon in each pot. So the pre-mordant basically helps the dye stick to the fabric so that when you're washing it, it's not just going to like come off. So I first started trying this process when I was doing my Bachelor of Fine Art. I was looking at some of the methods that had been done in ancient Ireland, some of the stuff that they used, the dye stuff, so saffron, different kinds of mud, moss, that kind of thing. It was something that I learned by doing research into, I suppose, like my ancestors and what they would have done. I always pop these in a bit of muslin just so that the dye is even and you don't get patterns on your fabric, which can often happen if you just throw them in raw. And then those are ready to just be put into the pot. I like to bring the water up to boiling, and then once it's boiling I turn it down and let it simmer, let the dye come out. This one was boiling and now it's simmering. I just like to kind of swish it around and get all the dye that I can out. That's looking a lot more pigmented. There's lots of superstition around dyeing in Ireland, particularly ancient Ireland. You wouldn't just dye your wool and then weave it. You would have to weave it and then dye it. It was like bad luck for men to be in the kitchen while the women were dyeing while the women were weaving. I've always had a real interest in women's history, particularly my family. I was really interested in women passing on traditions, women passing on stories. I find superstition a really beautiful way of passing on beliefs to the next generation. The saffron bath is ready for some fabric. Silk tends to really absorb whatever it's put into, and linen probably a lot less, and then cotton's kind of in between the two. It's really important that your pot is simmering during this process. You don't want to shock the fabric because it gets some fuzzy fibres that come out of it if you do. So this is probably, a good temperature. You can kind of put your hand in there, it's warm, it's not boiling. This is the linen going in, and then this is the cotton. I like an uneven look on the fabric, but if you do want it to be perfect, either take this out or just make sure that it's not sitting in a pocket of the fabric, because that's going to get all the dye. Make sure all of that is submerged. I'm going to leave the little pouch of blueberries in here because I like it when it's a little bit uneven and you've got some cute patterns. So that's the linen going in. That dye really quickly. And now that it's kind of cool, you want to kind of bring it back up again until it begins to boil again. I like the idea of sharing crafts. It often turns into a moment of sharing stories and sharing memories. It becomes this really organic conversation around family and tradition. Yeah, I find that really rewarding. That definitely came from my mom. So this one's ready to be turned off. The best way to tell is that you see bubbles. So you don't want it too boiling. Hot to the point that it's simmering, you see a few bubbles, turn it off then. I wouldn't let it get so hot that they're all coming out, because again that's going to shock your fabric. Let it cool completely back to room temperature before you remove it. This gives it time to soak up all of the dye matter. I'm going to try and get as much under the water as I can. My mum used to tell this story when I was a kid. They had this special tree on the road out of their town. If people wanted something, almost like a wishing tree, they would tie fabric around the tree, usually yellow fabric, and kind of wait until that had disintegrated. It became known as the wart tree because lots of people who had warts would tie it on the tree and then their warts would go. She would also tell me stories of fairy rings, which I really believed as a kid. Somebody would be at the pub late at night and they would be going home to their family and they would stumble across a fairy ring. And if you stumbled across a fairy ring, which was essentially flowers in a circle, usually in the middle of a field, if you walked through it, you would never get home, which is probably a poor excuse for people who'd just gotten drunk and couldn't get home. This is my favourite part of fabric dyeing because things never really turn out how you expect them to unless you've done it before. In the past when I've dyed with silk, it's really held the colour a lot better than any other fibre content, but with the berries it seems to have held it less, which is really interesting. They've turned out these really beautiful colours. So this is the berries. And it's really interesting to see the different pinks that you get with the different fibres. They just look like a little bit of a different pink. And then this one is more of a baby pink. That's going to be a really cool colour, especially down the bottom there where all the berries were. This is saffron. I'm really excited to see it once it's dried. And I'm just going to leave them in the pot until they're ready to come out. You can leave it overnight if you feel like it hasn't soaked up all the dye that you want. The kind of rule of thumb is that if nothing happens overnight, it's not going to happen. So after you finish dyeing, you basically want to rinse the fabric. Just once over should be fine. You'll be able to tell if you've pre-mortared correctly because not too much dye should come out of it. Shouldn't be spilling out. Always wash with cold water. You can just use a wool wash. You don't really want to put it in the machine. You want to look after it and hand wash it. Wash them like you would like anything that's delicate.